Hello and welcome to part 2 of the aircraft carrier debate. Oh good lord. Yes, I'm recording this. I'm not sure when it's going to go up. It might go up on the Thursday if I've needed to do some things for my mum, because my mum's, those watching the channel know my mum's having some health stuff, so she's theoretically got a medical appointment on Thursday, so if that's taking place then I might not be back in time for the live. But if I'm there for the live, then who knows when this video will go up. But let's see. And there is a part 1 for this, so if you want to go watch that, please do. There should be a link down below to part 1.
It's the unnecessary, and which you can understand them putting in because of the incidents that have happened and because of... Again, you have to be very careful. If you're flooding your own ship, you have to be very careful.
Let's go back a little bit, because I think I need to sort of talk about this flooding a bit more. So let's go down to roughly 59. It's roughly halfway through.
When you're doing it, and they are very cautious when they do it. But that's not saying... Being cautious about doing something is not the same as not doing it. And the trouble is, some people take the caution as meaning you don't do it, i.e. you don't let water into your ship, versus the actual thing is you don't do it. There's a key phrase in that concept, in the sort of you don't let water unnecessarily, and the unnecessarily word is basically the DNC. And
I am sure someone's probably commented, oh yes, you know, something along the lines of, well, it's, you know, it's the correct wordage, you know, it's the vagueness of it, unnecessarily. That's not really a vague wording, because if you think about it, only as much as is necessary. So that means it's basically cautious. Add in a counter flood. Take in more water if you need it. But err on the side of caution. Maybe you don't get enough to get perfectly righted. But, you know, as long as you're closer to, you know, if you've got, the example is Indomitable with the 11 degrees list, you know, that's quite a sort of significant thing. Well, if you got it back to a 2 degree list, you wouldn't really worry about that. That's probably not going to affect you much in movement. Or a 1 degree list. So it's basically, it's phraseology which is determined to make you think of counterflooding in the correct way.
The Third Sea Lord's office is going, you can do this, but you need to be careful when you do it, because there had been incidents where officers had been, oh yes, we must counterflood, and they'd end up the ship just seesawing because they'd managed to put in so much water. So they add in, they don't do it unless it's necessary, and you get people thinking that means you don't do it at all. As I said,
the joy of humanity.
In nicest way, Admiral Henderson, or actually also Admiral Fraser, the Third Sea Lord, the guy who takes over after Henderson as Third Sea Lord, would have both quite happily have done the full Admiral Duncan to a mutineer thing of dangling them out the window, holding them by their neck, going, gee.
For those who don't know, Admiral Duncan is the Admiral who commands the Naval Camperdown. He's a massive Scottish Admiral in the Royal Navy. There is quite a tradition of ships being named after him. There's even a Type 45 to this day, which is named HMS Duncan named for him. And it's actually quite likely, to my mind, that if the Royal Navy had really been going with representation of, you know, Britain with the N3s, because the G3s were going to be admirals. I'm sorry, I know there's lots of people who sort of come up with various ideas, but the naming committee never goes for one. But the thing is, the Nelson and the whole debate about whether you should next ship should be named Lord Nelson or Nelson is going on at about the right time. And they decide on Nelson. And so that's why there's a Nelson pack. And Rodney pack comes from the Admiral class battlecruisers which weren't completed. So I think you've got Nelson added on to the 3 names from the Admiral class, which are going to be what's used for the G3s. Rather than Saints, the Royal Navy might have gone for Admirals from 4 corners. And Admiral Duncan was due a ship. So I reckon an N3 would have been Admiral Duncan, and I reckon the other three would have been suitable other admirals, especially if you've got a Nelson and Rodney. You can go through them. You could maybe have St. Vincent. He's got an interesting family stock, and you could have had an admiral representing each. That's far more likely for the Royal Navy than any saint names, because okay, there's all sorts of things which people go for as it being appropriate, and I've discussed this at various points in common response videos, as well as in a video about why I don't think the saint names are likely. But the biggest issue with them is honestly the whole it sounds Catholic. And the Royal Navy had literally not had saint names. Even St. George, if you look at it, it comes up very rarely. And when it almost ultimately, whenever it does come up, it's being pushed by royal external factors, not political external factors. The Royal Navy gets very interesting when politicians try and push names on them. The royal family can get away with things. Politicians can't, and the Royal Navy almost used to go in the opposite direction when a politician suggested. But saying that to one side, Admiral Duncan famously, and getting back to the story of him, famously there were mutinies going on in the Navy at the time, before the Battle of Camperdown, and on his own ship, when the crew were considering mutiny, he took one of the ringleaders, held them up by their neck, one-handed, over the side of the ship, and said, "Does anyone question my right to command?" Surprising enough, they all decided not to. And I've often wondered if the whole Vader strangling people image is sort of in some ways modelled on that, although subconsciously, because that's the real-life historical example of an admiral doing that. He didn't actually kill the person. The person, so interesting enough, he didn't have any punishments after that. No, he didn't. For some reason, he didn't need to. Everyone just decided that, no, he's in charge, and, yeah, we're not going there. We have urgent things we need to do. We need to go and polish the top of the mast, or, polish the bilges. Yes, we need anything, but no one wants to be near him. He's in charge.
You have lost me a carrier for being stupid. You cannot read. And that's the thing. It's the unnecessary, and which you can understand them putting in because of the incidents that have happened, and because of, again, you have to be very careful. If you're flooding your own ship, you have to be very careful, because if you add in too much water, you can create a seesaw motion or cause electricals and all sorts of issues. There are very legitimate reasons for being cautious, but that's not the same as not doing it. And all carriers have a high metacentric height. You know, Ark Royal has, and she doesn't alarm. Because the carrier has put so much high up. You know?
And that, of course, though, is one of the justifications for it being a structure as opposed to the strength deck. But,
that would lower weight, but that also lowers the capacity of your flight deck to take weight landing on it, if it's not a strength deck. So, basically, everything works against the rules of shipbuilding when you're looking at an aircraft carrier. You almost want to put in really heavy engines and really dense ballast to try and balance it out, and that's what most of the carrier constructors do.
Still see Franklin healing quite heavily with her, as a result of her firefighting efforts and other ships. So. Yeah, I don't know. It's just that it's one of those lines that is often thrown around, which I've not had the ability to counter argue myself, because I just don't know enough about that level of engineering.
It's also like the idea of the air group side. I sit there and go, people tell me, oh yes, they have a massive these have fastball air group, but as I always now seems to have become a meme, I've been told at some point, but I haven't seen it myself. You know, the Royal Navy are looking to do this.
Yes.
The American and Japanese are looking to do this. And there's a difference in how you're going to build it. And, you know, the Royal Navy can afford to get that with their battle carriers, because, as I said, the battle carriers were conceptually going to be as close to the actual battle as possible. This doesn't mean they're supposed to be taking part in it. Again, as we said, there are some Royal Navy armoured carriers armoured hangar carriers, which do think they should be taking part in the battle line. But the vast majority understand the concept they're supposed to stay slightly further back. But it's kind of...
Or, rather speaking, the vast majority do not get the chance. The vast majority do not get the chance because their admirals refuse to allow them. If Cunningham couldn't control you ships, we won't, so we're just going to keep you back. This is why I worry when they said... I think the idea of putting Vian in charge of them was probably not a good idea, because if anyone was going to actually encourage their fighting tendencies rather than the holding back tendencies, it would have been Vian.
Like HMS Eskimo and losing her bow in battles. There are some ships which don't understand the concept of what they're supposed to be doing all the time.
Yes. All right, so then, okay, the ultimate test, I guess, is Mediterranean, and I guess Takashima Gunto. There you are. You have your armoured carriers in close proximity, not necessarily right underneath, but except for in Illustrious's case, yes, she was right underneath. But at least by the time that Indomitable and Victorious were doing pedestal, they had the good sense of turning back at the Straits, the Sicilian Straits. But those are not exactly minor operations.
To be fair, Lister didn't want to turn back. If Lister had his way, he'd have gone right and went through the Malta.
Yes, well, I think there would have been a few Italian torpedo boats that might have had a thing to say about that.
We got 4.5-inch guns, those torpedo boats will be fine. Yeah. You have to remember, again, this goes back to the point that the Royal Navy bake a willingness to fight battles into their officers from a very, very early on. It's a willingness...
And a willingness to believe that their systems will work, and they will find a way to make those systems work. Those systems might not necessarily be the best systems, but they will find a way. They can think of a tactic or something to make them work. And again, with the torpedo boats, you have to consider there would have been a far larger escort because of them with them. And yes, they're 4.5-inch guns. Because the carriers weren't going back unescorted. They had their own escorts with them. So that would have been an impact. I do agree with Jamie, though. I do think the torpedo boats in those scenarios would probably have had definitely exhilarating targets to try and go for. But there again, they'd have also probably had constant air patrols to try and counter them with air search radar on them. So, what's our search radar? So it would be interesting. It would be interesting.
To engage the enemy, and it's critical to the Royal Navy because, as I said, the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy is often smaller than other navies in terms of the local area. Even when it's the largest navy in the world, it's smaller. So it's got to achieve a level of psychological dominance, in a way, over the enemy. It's got to be the one which... It's always got to act like it's the bigger navy, even when it's the smaller navy in a locality. It's always got to act like we are invincible.
It's always got to project the image of, yes, we will attack you, and if they take losses, we just come back again. And so it's basically to try and give the enemy the idea of, they're nuts. We cannot win. Because for the Royal Navy, it's key. And it's one of the reasons why I talk about that being the benchmark Navy and why that was so important to them. Because you want your own opponent to constantly be comparing themselves to you, to constantly think about you and what you would do. Because that means they're automatically thinking of you as something that is good, that is better. Even if they try and decry it, the moment they're thinking and comparing themselves to you, they've automatically lost that fight.
Because that's how it keeps the other navies thinking about it. Because the other navies going, well, if they're so confident, they must have more, they must have this, they must have... that's how the Royal Navy works. Quite a lot of the war in the Mediterranean, the Royal Navy has less ships there than the Italians do. Yes, the Italians don't have an aircraft carrier and all something, but the Italians usually actually have more ships, and they're usually more concentrated than the Royal Navy's ones, which are at least spread about that direction, if not all over the place. But the Royal Navy, at any point in World War II, you can never really say there's a point that the Italian Navy is morally dominant and ascendant in the Mediterranean over the Royal Navy. Because the Royal Navy might be small, but the Royal Navy is always willing to engage.
Even when I would say the Regia Marina are actually winning, and there are battles where a draw is the best you can claim as a British historian, if you want to. But you could claim it's an outright strategic victory for the Italians at certain points in some battles. If not quite a tactical one. And mainly it's not a tactical one because of luck and aggression on the part of the Royal Navy's side. But even when they achieve that, they never feel that. The Italians never feel that they're the dominant. The British worry they're losing it, but the Italians never feel they are. And that's part of this.
No. And part of it they can do that because they build their ships to engage. You can argue that. And again, that goes back to the metacentric height of the armoured Hagan carriers. You build your ship to fight. And you build it to take damage because it's going to take damage. That's one of the interesting things. You can you think about the Royal Navy carrier design versus the other navies. They are designing their carriers with the idea they're going to take damage and they're going to have to keep fighting the whole way through. Even Ark Royal, which of course isn't listed as an armoured hangar carrier, but does have the flight deck as the strength deck, does have pretty thick steel on both that level and the hangar level. They might not be armour, but it's pretty thick steel. She is still pretty strong. She's designed to take damage and carry on and try and carry on working. You know,
I'm getting to this debate quite often with people about Ark Royal because they try and project things onto her which she isn't. It's like I've had discussions where people have gone, well, she was unarmoured. She wasn't unarmoured. She does actually have armoured decks, etc. She just doesn't have the same places that the Illustrious class have. And she has a lot of capabilities. She's built very, very strongly. She's built for the strike carrier role, though. And that's a key part of her. She's built for the strike carrier role, and that affects her duty, her shaping. But that's far closer to that role than what the Americans and Japanese perceive their carriers to be, and want their carriers to be for their role in the Pacific. So people often start to tell her, well, she's a Pacific carrier. She's not. Certainly it's an interesting thing when you consider her and HMS Unicorn. The other vessel which could be most easily deployed to the Far East. And I've talked about this as Unicorn in terms of she has the ability to repair, maintain stuff because she has lots of shops aboard her, is also Ark Royal, because Ark Royal can use the upper hangar as her operational hangar and her lower hangar as her maintenance hangar. So she can do that. So again, she's another one which is often considered as Far East deployments. But it's not because she is the Far Eastern ship, it's because the attributes of her role and of her design for a strike carrier role mean that she's better for that deployment if they've got a peacetime deployment. But they prefer not to have her there. Why? Because they consider it might be a bit of too much of a threat, having the strike carrier there, especially one called Ark Royal. So they were thinking more about having her elsewhere, and she could well have found herself in the Indian Ocean. I would not be surprised if Unicorn was based in the China station, and Ark Royal found itself in the East Indies. Because again, it means you have her near there, and it's a similar area where there's a similar lack of support available, and it means theoretically, if it becomes necessary for operational reasons, she can deploy forward, and she's got Unicorn with her. So you've technically got a 2-carrier force if you need to. Quickly, because again, the Royal Navy is really worried about the Japanese trying to seize and go south into the South China Sea to wait for them. Now, you might sit there and go, well, how are the Japanese going to do that? Because operationally, they'd have to seize either French or American territory to get there. Well, here's a dirty little secret about the British. They know how dependent the French are on them for their empire's security. And they don't necessarily trust that the French will maintain security of all their territories. They worry that they could fall quickly. They also think that the Japanese, they expect them to be something more creative in terms of using civilian ships, etc., to help deploy them forward rapidly. And they also sort of consider that the Americans have lots of defences one end of the Philippines, but don't the other, and if the Japanese came round, boom, they could quickly seize a point that they could then use as a supply position, and then, while projecting the fleet forward, was their idea. They weren't sure how the Japanese could do it, but they were worried about the Japanese being able to do it, as it was the worst case scenario for the Royal Navy, because that would be the point at which their forces were in the most confined space. So it's one of those scenarios where the Royal Navy is fearing it because of the risk it would be, not necessarily because of the viability of their opponents in actually doing it.
This is the Royal Navy they're thinking about. Their whole plan is they're going to be sailing to harm's way.
Ultimately, it seemed to be a pretty convincing argument, because you end up seeing Taiho and Midway.
Yes, yes. So basically, everyone else copies the British, but it's, that's the fun thing.
But, is that true though? Because again, both Japan and the United States were doing their experiments with paper designs for armored fight deck carriers in the 30s as well. They were at least exploring these concepts in the same way that the Royal Navy was. It's just that their particular circumstances at the time didn't seem to suit that approach.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Everyone's looking at it. The thing is, every one of them has skilled naval architects who can look at it. It's only the British who plumb for it, and the British plumb for it because the British are thinking, what are we going to do? The British are thinking, we're going to be fighting on the outside of the world from where we can build ships. We're fighting from the outside of the world where we can do our major repairs on ships. So that's why the British go for the armour. The other case, of course, is they could be fighting in the Mediterranean, where there's no getting away from land bases. Just isn't. So you have a choice. The British have two scenarios where the armoured carrier makes sense. The battle carrier makes sense. You've got it in the Mediterranean, where you're surrounded, or the Far East, where you're far away from everything that can support you and repair you. So you better have a ship which is as easy to repair as possible, but is also as survivable as possible, so it's going to take the minimum amount of damage.
And that's actually quite an important thing to think about. The amount of times I hear people focus on, it's fighting the Mediterranean. It's almost like they believe the Royal Navy's obsessed with fighting the Italians. And those same people then go, the British were preparing to fight war against the Germans. Well, why do they think they were going to fight in the Germans in the Mediterranean? It's an interesting circular argument. The Royal Navy aren't. The Royal Navy cannot afford to prepare to fight and cannot afford to have ships which are specialists to one region. They have to fit in their overall battle plan, their overall fleet operations, and their overall capabilities. And to an extent, I would agree that the Illustrious class and those other vessels built like them are more suitable for Mediterranean operations. But that is a factor of their construction, not the purpose of their construction. It's an outcome of how they are built and why they're built, not the aim for it.
And keep its air group operating, because to replenish the air group and replenish the ship, it's going to be difficult. So that's why the British go for it. The Americans and Japanese, I don't say they treat their carriers as disposable assets, but they are thinking about fighting that big battle. And sometimes I wonder, I look at their concepts for what they're going to be using their carriers after that big battle, and I wonder if they've really thought it through. Because most of them are sort of things like, there'll be a big battle, we'll fight the battle, where the carriers will deliver their big punches, and we'll win, and then whatever's left of the fleet will go and harry the other one's coast or something like that. And you sit there and go,
I always like to scratch my nose on it. I'm actually seeing my scratching my nose. I'm getting a desire to scratch my nose now. It's subconscious, I swear. I don't know what it is. Sometimes I get accused by people going, "Oh, you must be picking your nose." I'm going, "No, I'm scratching the edge of my nose." I have no idea why this point it itches so often. It just does.
Are you really thinking about your are you thinking about the sheer amount of damage you're going to take in this big battle? Or are you presuming that you're going to be entirely victorious and the enemy's not?
I would hate to presume by suggesting what I think they're doing, but you can draw your own inferences.
Yeah. Well, I guess certainly I think it's, that concept did sort of rely on the overwhelming victory, didn't it?
Yeah, it does. That's just the thing. And it's almost the interesting thing, because the Royal Navy's, I would argue, actually the more aggressive navy of the three, in its terms of the way it's teaching its officers to act and its officers to think. I would argue, actually, the Royal Navy is the most aggressive of the three, which, again, can get me into trouble, but I'm still looking at going, well, the Royal Navy is the one which is teaching its officers whatever ships you're in are the ships you go and fight with, and you fight. Whereas the other navies are sort of both are far more measured, far more controlled. In a way, it's far more centrally directed force structures in terms of their approach to fighting a naval war. If you look at the Japanese especially, that is very, very rigid in a way of its command structure.
Incredibly admiral heavy. Incredibly admiral heavy. I've done some videos recently on some of the battles which the Japanese were in, and the USN is sort of, the USN forces are commanded by a rear admiral and some captains and maybe a commodore if you're lucky, and the Japanese have multiple vice admirals, rear admirals, commands of forces which are far smaller. The fact is, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it does make sense to the Japanese and the way their command structure works at this time period, because honestly there are different factions within the Japanese, and some believe in giving a lot of diversified commands to junior officers and junior personnel. Others are very much tight welded force. And I would say that's to do with when their navy comes of age in many regards, because the Royal Navy had come into that scenario and been looking at that scenario prior to World War One, and was trying to get themselves out of that scenario still when they got into World War One. And World War One happened, and you had, of course, the Harwich Force and all these things, which were far smaller, far more fluid forces. And so they leave World War One with a bit of a task force mentality and distributed forces scenario going on. The US Navy oscillates between the two in the 1920s and 30s. There are large exercises especially starting to show that maybe the idea of very tightly controlled forces. But the Japanese look back on Tsushima, where of course the Admiral had maintained very, very tight control of his forces during the critical points. They forget how much he lets go of control after those critical points. So in the decisive time he keeps tight control of the forces and lets go. But the image they want to project afterwards, and they think about afterwards, is they're focusing in on that tight control he had during the decisive moments. And that's their focus. Okay, this is going to be long.
It does allow freedom of operation for captains, because honestly, in no military structure can you keep captains of ships from doing their own thing. You really can't. The moment they're in charge of a ship, they're the god on the ship, so they can do what they like. But you have far more, I would say, the Japanese have far tighter control. The Americans then are slightly looser than that and getting more aggressive in some respects. And then the British are almost the loosest, going, yeah, you all know will know what you're doing. This is sort of, we're working this. Yes, they have task force. Yes, they have doctrine, all these things. But they have things written in there like destroyers, if they see an opportunity, can mount a torpedo attack. You have things like the box system, which they use for harrying battleships at night. Now, the box system is a pretty cool idea, but the idea is you have a destroyer take each corner of a box, and another destroyer, or possibly another 2 destroyers, hang out to fill in those spots. And those 2 officers who are hanging out, because it's at night, have got to work out if one of the corners has been taken, then take the corner, and then carry out their independent attacks in turn on the ship. This is what the Royal Navy, this is what the travel destroyers under Philip Ian do to Bismarck all night. They've practiced this. But you've got therefore night command going on where they aren't making radio signals, where they aren't flashing lights at each other because they don't want to reveal their positions. And they
Other than the Polish ship destroyer, which likes to keep flashing its lights at Bismarck, going, "I'm Polish," or rather, we're Polish. You know, it just what they like to do.
keep attacking the Bismarck. You know, that's not a scenario where you're going to maintain tight or rigid control. You've got to place enormous faith in lieutenant commanders, junior officers, quite comparatively junior officers in a major situation.
And from memory, I can recall reports where Admiral Vian was often in trouble with his US liaison officers for not following such tight fleet formations with the British Pacific Fleet in the way they're supposed to move in rigid and coordinated ways. I seem to recall that one of the major complaints was he still continued to treat the carriers somewhat separately from the main body to a degree, whereas the poor old American liaison officer was going, no.
But it worked for the British way to fight. That's the thing. He treats the British carriers and the carriers as sort of separate force, but that's because, in a way, he's sitting there thinking, what are we using these assets for? What are we here for? We're here to fight. We're not here to preserve the carriers. We're here to use the carriers. We're here to use the carrier force. And it's the whole British approach. One of the interesting discussions you get between the British and the Americans over carriers, again, the British carriers are built arguably more survivable than their American counterparts, but the British are far more likely to risk them than the American counterparts. Especially by the end, especially towards the end of the war. When the Americans have more carriers coming online, they're actually starting to build more survivable carriers, the Midway class, and yeah, the British are.
They're still the ones put closest to Japan, yes.
Yeah, and the British are going, yeah, and the British are the ones who. You look at the plans for invasion of Japan. If it happens, if the nuclear bombs don't work, or nuclear bombs aren't used, and quite a lot of those plans are basically presuming that by D+5 or D+6, the only air support you're going to get is from the British carriers. Because they're the ones which are going to still be able to be working, because they're reckoning the American carriers by that point will have been worn down by kamikazes.
And they're expecting the air bases, which they're planning on building, and yes, they've got lots of troops and specialists who are going to build them, including the Seabees, will be dealing with guerrilla warfare and suicide attacks so much that they won't get any air bases completed and secured for operations till D+10 was some of their estimates. They had some earlier ones, but most of those earlier ones were based on the ideas of, if we can capture X or Y little island off the coast and build an airfield on that. And usually their response is, yeah, you do that, you're also going to have to build a port. Well, that's what we did for D-Day, we built a port. Okay. Because you're going to have to build something to get the supplies into the airfield. Because it's not just about an airfield, you have to build supplies up ashore, you have to support the aircraft, and it's all sorts of fun stuff. But yeah, they were really not looking forward to it.
I'll have to get you to supply me some of those sources so I can put that in my site.
Yeah,
A discussion for another day.
Yeah, but I've got actually the book I got that from somewhere around me, literally looking at me. I think it was this one. I think it was Reynolds. I think it's him who mentions it. But I also found it in some British books as well. And It's it's the typical projections, which actually I'm not sure I agree with, because they're basically presuming that the Japanese are actually going to get better at getting through the big blue blanket, which I doubt they will do. And I think there will be American carriers still around. But I also think that you can understand them presuming on this because they're looking at the way the individual carriers are performing. I also don't think the British carriers are as invulnerable as sometimes the Americans seem to market them as when they're trying to justify building the midway class. Yes, we're justifying building the midway class. It's their fault, they are invulnerable. Well, we've got to do therefore build the British carriers. And you sit there and go, they're really not, but hey ho.
You have to remember, there's a difference between being built invulnerable and being built strong enough to resist weaker attacks, but also absorb the damage from more dangerous attacks and still be repairable. And that is the difference. That is often misunderstood by the armoured carriers. The idea was that the British were attempting to make them invulnerable. They weren't. The British were attempting to make them so that they could be more easily repaired, and so they would withstand damage better. They wouldn't be invulnerable. They would not be invulnerable. There's no way you can build a ship that's going to be invulnerable. A battleship or aircraft carrier, you just can't do it. You're building it to withstand the damage more successfully, and to be able to be more easily repaired after the damage.
Yeah, it's a fun time, but as we've sort of been over, you're far more the carrier operations in World War II guy, and sort of what do you think what the British are getting up to?
Look, I mean, I see mostly just improvisation and necessity, because literally, as you've described, this is the worst case scenario: a war on three fronts, which the worst case, the worst plan before that was a war on two fronts, with, as you said, three being the nightmare. So, as you say, the plans were there for these carriers to operate in groups, not necessarily big massed forces. I suppose in many ways it's to me it seems as though the Royal Navy was headed down a very similar path to that of the United States, which was carriers operating, a couple of carriers operating together. Now the US would operate those two carriers independently together, meaning that one would be just over the horizon while the other one was a little bit closer, so that if one of them spotted, then you don't lose both. But they're still essentially the one unit. Whereas the Royal Navy would still have its two carriers in the middle of the task force, supported by the rebuilt Queen Elizabeths and the rebuilt Renown with their heavy AA outfits. So a difference there, but similar in the sense of groups of two or three carriers here operating in different locations. But of course that very rapidly gets stripped down once you lose Courageous and Glorious, and even more so once you lose Ark Royal. And then it's basically the carriers are put where they need them the most, and that's protecting the Russian convoys from is doing the classic role of the British carriers, I think, in the early war years, which is interdicting, destroying the reconnaissance and disrupting incoming. Sorry? Well, cruiser carrier role, but it's the role being done by the ship that you have, because you don't have the cruiser carrier, you don't have the escort carrier, you've only got Victorious, you've only got Formidable, you've only got Illustrious. Okay, yes, you've got Furious and Argus, but those are doing more, and Eagle, but those are doing more support roles, I suppose, and pressed into the front line when necessary as well. But that's basically the job that I see all three of those carriers doing, which is that mobile air superiority bubble over whatever is deemed to be of importance at the time. So knocking down those shadowers being the primary role, secondary role, fighters disrupting, not shooting down, but disrupting the incoming attacks, and thirdly, strikes of opportunity. You're seeing, Ark Royal launches swordfish attack against Italian dams in 1940. So that's a precursor to the.
That's half the things the Royal Navy is getting up to its carriers. It's doing all sorts of random things, but I think one of the interesting things I'm looking forward to is Dirac is currently working on a series which is about the big convoys in World War II, and I'm looking at doing some convoy videos for World War II because the next year, of course, is the year of the aircraft carrier and flagship. Maybe just the year of the aircraft carrier. I'm tacking in the flagship mainly because I still want to do some Age of Sail stuff, but I might just ignore that and just do the aircraft carriers. It's still debating it, and at the moment I've got time to debate it in my head because I don't have to put out the next year list till after Christmas. So that's good. That gives me time to debate and to think. But a lot of very interesting operations get carried out by Royal Navy carriers in World War II. Now, of course, there is discussions about this which relates back to HMS Glorious and what she was doing. And the trouble with that, the trouble with her being off on some sort of super secret operation to mine Swedish bases, etc., by flying across Norway and launching aircraft to do that, is it doesn't really logically fit with the operational requirements that Royal Navy was looking at that time. There are some things which lead me to be intrigued by that suggestion and the evidence, and the involvement of Winston Churchill and various others doing various silly things always makes it quite possible, because there are quite a lot of people who like to dream of different ideas. But I think myself, in the case of Glorious's demise, I put it down more to an overabundance of people following, doing, almost behaving like it's peacetime still. In that you have people letting this carrier go off with 2 destroyers, and as I've said in the previous video, that's actually a smaller protection force than they normally ended up with them and sailing with them in peacetime. They normally had double that in peacetime. Sending a ship off with just 2 destroyers as escort in wartime, as valuable asset as an aircraft carrier, is not only against doctrine, it's against policy, it's against everything. And to suggest that that would be being sent on any form of operation under those circumstances is, frankly, again, to me, that would be behaving criminally negligent by all involved. Because that's just not what the Royal Navy does. If you consider in similar operations where they take place, usually you find a fast capital ship. Often Renown, sometimes Hood, sometimes some King George V's, a cruiser, and a flotilla of destroyers, i.e. 8 to 9 destroyers. It's a very different force escorting a carrier and being part of that force than 2 destroyers. And that would have been a very different group for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to come across, because if Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had come across and it had been Glorious with, let's say, Renown or maybe Warspite or something like that, a county-class cruiser and a full flotilla of destroyers, I have no doubt that Scharnhorst and Gneisenau A would have turned around and tried to get away from there as quickly as possible. I also have no doubt that they would have had an air patrol going, because they'd have had an admiral present. And the fact they didn't have any aircraft airborne, even if you do sort of use the phrase of, well, the scenario that people go is they were rearming all their aircraft, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Operational doctrine suggests there should at least be an aircraft airborne, even if that means you're taking 1 aircraft off the cumulative strike package. You keep an aircraft airborne from a carrier to provide overwatch. You do.
Dam buster raids. Everyone's forgotten about, but again, it actually happened. They ran the Swordfish and dropped torpedoes against a dam because it was a target of opportunity, while Ark Royal was running along doing a convoy protection run. You see Illustrious doing similar little raids here and there. You see Formidable providing that air defense bubble for the battleships as they go and bombard Tripoli. Not to mention dropping the flares, of course, for the carrier fleet. That's pre-war doctrine, as far as I'm aware. Again, in close support of the battle fleet. And then you're seeing it attempt to do its interdiction role, which is launch an air raid against the Italian and Italian and German dive bombers, the Ju-87s at what's the name of the island just north of Crete, northeast of Crete, anyway, I can't think of its name.
Yeah, you and I are good at history, not always so good at geography.
No, not so good at names.
Scarpanta.
Anyway,
I can find
geography's
it on a
fine.
map, but I cannot remember its name.
Anyway, that's where Formidable gets into trouble because her full Mars are falling out of the sky due to a lack of spare parts, thanks to the bombing raid on Coventry, and the poor old Albacores just don't really get to do much damage when they do their runs on the airfields, and Formidable take.
That's something else which you also have to think about in terms of logistics, and something which the Royal Navy, I would argue, overlooked in the run-up to World War II. If you could really blame anyone for anything, it's not diversifying their source of spare parts. They did look at Ceylon. They did look at modern Sri Lanka. So they looked at Ceylon as setting up some sort of facilities there for spare parts of things and manufacture things, and because that was part of India but not part of India, so therefore they could probably get it through without as much trouble, because the India itself never seemed to be that supportive of the Navy putting much of her forces there. And it doesn't happen, but I think it might have happened if war had held off for a few more years. It would be interesting to see what would happen if they'd had a logistic source in the Indian Ocean that could have produced spare parts for engines, etc. That would have helped the Royal Navy greatly. It would have been interesting to see how it worked and who would have run it. Whether it had been Rolls-Royce, I have a feeling if it's going to be anyone, it actually might have been Napier. Rather than Bristol or Rolls-Royce, I think it might be Napier which would have been given the job of setting up the factory and running it. But either way, it would be interesting.
Takes 2 1,000-kilogram bomb hits because of it, but actually still remains operational as she returns home. She's still launching Cap again 15 minutes after taking those 2 big hits, but that's where the less than optimal situation is made evident, I suppose. When you've only got the one deck, you haven't got much reserve. You haven't got any reserve.
No, and that's the thing. The Royal Navy at that point is functioning without a reserve. It's lost all these ships, and if you think about it, I often think the biggest problem for the Royal Navy, and I sit there and I'm looking at it and I'm going, well, HMS Unicorn is being built, but she's become a sort of template for the light fleet carrier.
She's also delayed. She is delayed for 2 years as well.
Yeah.
So you're looking there at these 3 great ships, or potentially very, very useful ships, of course. But then again, you've still got to feed the British Isles. So I can't understand.
And these are the ships, but I think what I'm sort of considering is that actually the escort carrier, the converted merchant ship to a carrier with the deck, is again not a new idea for the Royal Navy. They have had plans going around looking at it. Argus, of course, was the template for the model, and they had
Audacity was a great proof of concept.
Yes, so they had all these things. They had them sort of going around. What I often wonder is if, again, this is one of the big what ifs, and it comes back to the officers in charge, because when Henderson dies, there's a gap in the 3rd Sea Lord posting for a while, and until Fraser gets put in charge, and he sort of pushes on. But he's far less experienced than Henderson, and he's far less capable of pushing. And I wonder what the difference would have been if there had been either Henderson had handed over a year or 2 earlier someone, so there was some more experience in the post of 3rd Sea Lord, and then Henderson was off in another fleet position when he died, or if he had lived a bit longer, and so you still had experience. Because I have a feeling, I'm not sure the carriers would have been stopped for 2 years. I think a way would have been found to keep them going while still supplying the Battle Atlantic. I have that feeling that they wouldn't have been stopped, because if there's one person who, the 3rd Sea Lords, not just Henderson but even his predecessor, are drumming home the fact that the Royal Navy carriers are essential. They need to be built up, and their numbers need to be done. It's always the third Sea Lords who seem to be making the case, and the first Sea Lords seem to be going after the battleship. If you look in the meetings, that's really what comes through. But also, I wonder if you might have found an escort carrier style production started a lot earlier to fill the cruiser carrier role, and that could be really interesting if you had a couple of those ships through, because they're quite quick to build. And if you think about what they'd have done in terms of freeing up assets for other things, they could have been really, really useful. Because you start off with a match,
of course,
and then you go.
This is where I've seen the counter argument for this one, and it makes a lot of sense. You've got to remember the loss rate in the Atlantic at this point.
Yeah.
You're losing so many more merchant hulls than you are building. That escort carrier is a luxury, which is why when one comes along unexpectedly, in the form of the captured German vessel that became the basis of the Audacity, that was the only opportunity, the first opportunity they had to actually put it into effect, because every other hull was committed to replace those lost hulls in the North Atlantic. I
agree, but I have a feeling the first ones, the conversions, if they had done it, and there would have been the compromise, would have been that we will build something on top of them that will not impact their ability to act as freighters, still be able to act as or tankers. Probably it would have been the tankers which have been converted. I'm guessing, considering that some of them were converted to...
I am talking about something closer to Max ships, I think. Also in terms of escort carriers. But also, there is the other argument here, and this is the point to make. If you have escort carriers from earlier on, considering the rate of swordfish production, and the capabilities of swordfish in terms of the anti-submarine patrols, if you have escort carriers from earlier on, A, they're going to take a toll on condors if they're carrying any fighters, like Audacity did. B, they're going to take a toll on submarines. And that might well have stopped some of the highs. In fact, it might have ameliorated a lot of the highs. Because also, you have to consider, when the British track down have the information they have about German operations thanks to the Clarke and the Enigma, etc., they need a justification. They're always looking for a justification for why they didn't do something. Well, if you have escort carriers with convoys flying patrols, the patrol spotted submarines. Spotted submarines. You can just keep making up stories of convoys routing themselves away from packs of packs of submarine U-boats to, because of the spotting of aircraft, and you can just keep publicizing those stories. And that would make the Germans to an extent paranoid. And then every time there's a tale of a U-boat which doesn't come back because it's, they're going to presume it's because it was attacked by aircraft and all sorts of things. That is pretty much what you can do. But you need those ships in the first place. And they didn't have them.
LSGs, landing ship gantries, could well have been the Dale-class tankers which Henderson had ordered built in 1936, which were the big Dale-class, were the critical ones for fleet oil tanking and fleet tanking. I think a couple of them might have been converted. After all, some of them were converted to landing ship gantries, with still their fuel intact so they could refuel ships on the task forces. Again, you could have gone right now, so we need them. We need this tanker to keep the escorts going across the Atlantic anyway. If we can build a gantry at landing craft, we can certainly build a flight deck over it, and we can build some sort of hangar underneath that flight deck. And it's going to sound funny, but I think the argument I would certainly see Henderson make, and you see made in the exercises in the interwar years, is certainly that, yes, it means one is slightly more limited in its value as a merchant ship, but the protection it would offer to the anti-submarine warfare, because remember, the Royal Navy's already been practicing airborne anti-submarine warfare since the First World War. The Spider's Web and all that scenario off the coast of the UK had been critical to anti-submarine warfare. For them, as far as the aircraft were part of anti-submarine warfare, even in the interwar years. So having aircraft there and having something which could interdict, spotter enemy reconnaissance aircraft, so some fighters and some anti-submarine aircraft that sort of patrol and look for submarines on the surface, that seems a very useful asset, and it's an asset they can make the case for. I think there is a reluctance, though, to jump into it, because in many ways the Fleet Air Arm Naval Aviation loses its prince at court when it loses Henderson. And then Lister comes back after Taranto, after various other things, and becomes that again as the Fifth Sea Lord, and then you start to have the movements going along in the escort carriers and these things. But
the trouble is, Lister is not Third Sea Lord. Third Sea Lord is a post has a lot of power. Third Sea Lord is usually a junior admiral compared to the second or first Sea Lord in sort of their ranking, so they're going to go off and have commands. But they are, by tradition, they are there to represent the constructions and the capabilities and what can be built and the sort of things. They are very, very powerful because they present both what are the options for the rest of the Sea Lords in terms of what the options they can select from in terms of their construction, and then they go away and they are charged with the managing and the deliverance of those things. So they can make a lot of modifications. There are a lot of changes which happen to ships, and a lot of changes in terms of structuring and organizing and things which go through their office. They have a huge amount of power. I'm going to use a sort of mangling of a quote of the My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Okay, there's a great quote where the mum of the bride basically goes, well, if the husband is the head of the family, the mother is the wife is the neck and points the head where it wants to go. To be fair, when it comes to ship construction, the Third Sea Lord is the neck, the ears, and the eyes, and the mouth of the Sea Lords. So it points them where it wants them to go. It tells them, they tell them what they can do. They show them what they can do, and then when they make their decisions, they tell everyone what their decision was. That's incredibly powerful, if you think about that. That's incredibly powerful. Yes, I'm executing what they've decided in the way I want to after I've shown them the information I want to show them. Yeah, theoretically they can go out hunting for their own information, but to do that, they've got to not be doing their own jobs. And they're too busy dealing with their own stuff to be able to do that.
You needed someone up there in the Admiralty who was prepared to go make the case that, yes, we're at the coalface, yes, we're fine. But if we can get a better pickaxe, we can be so much more effective at the coalface. And the thing is, yes, we're losing merchant ships, but the two options we have to do is we can either try and build more, and we can never build as many as we are losing at the moment because it's going to take a lot of time, or we can slow the number we're losing, or we can do both. And the thing is, it's best to attempt to do both. But we're never going to build enough to cover all our losses every month because we can't without the Americans getting involved in the Liberty ship program. So honestly, option 2 is a very good thing to do to try and reduce your losses.
And the Canadians
But
and
you need someone
various
there
other powers building
who's
ships
sit there
for
and
us.
go, we need to make this case. And the thing is, when Henderson goes, you don't have anyone there. Then you have Fraser comes in, and after Fraser's got comfortable in the Third Sea Lord's office, he's then gone off to command fleets and other things. So he's gone away to the home fleet, and the trouble is the Third Sea Lord's post is not a post. You need someone experienced in it, because the trouble, what they're doing is they are converting what the Director Naval Construction is designing into something which makes sense to the Naval Service, and are explaining what the Naval Service needs back to the Director of Naval Construction. And yes, DNC Stanley Goodall is excellent, and he's been in post for a long time by this point. He was appointed by Henderson, so he's been there, so he knows what he's doing. But the trouble is, you need that Third Sea Lord. That Third Sea Lord is a very important post if you're going to be making this go back and forward.
Yes. Look, you know,
Someday I'm I'm already working on a series about all the Third Sea Lords and Directors of Naval Construction. It's a series I've got in mind of books to produce about them all. But I think one day it's going to be a big book about Third Sea Lords and about the role of the Royal Navy, the Office of the Third Sea Lord, in constructing the Royal Navy and how they've all impacted things. Because there have been some seriously powerful Third Sea Lords, and there have been some seriously weak ones. And when you look at the Royal Navy, its fortunes and how well its ships are doing, etc., and how well it's doing, people often try and draw a link between them and the First Sea Lords, but honestly, the Third Sea Lord, if you have a good Third Sea Lord and a bad First Sea Lord, things can be bad, but they never go terrible. If you have a good First Sea Lord and a bad Third Sea Lord, things can go very badly, because the First Sea Lord can be looking for ships and not have them available. And if you have both of bad, it's knockout time.
No doubt about it. There's just so many things at that time, isn't there, playing on the minds of everyone.
Yeah.
You've got, where are you going to get the aircraft from? Where are you going to get the pilots from? Where are you going to get the ships from? Where are you going to get the workers from to do the modifications? It's easy to second guess. But I suppose getting back to carrier doctrine,
I can see where Jamie's coming from at that point. It is easy to second guess, but it's also a case of they do find this stuff later on. And I'm not saying that means they have it available then. I mean, I'm saying they have the capacity to find it. They have the capacity. It's about priorities, and they prioritize converting those tankers to landing ship gantries instead of escort carriers. And this is the Dale class, and the things about their conversions is one of the reasons why people then turn around and go, the Royal Navy doesn't have fast fleet oilers. And you sit there and go, they did. Just some people had some bright ideas about how to use them, as we weren't fighting a war in the Far East, so didn't need them. Bright ideas. So many bright ideas.
To me, I suppose the embodiment of the whole design concept that you were talking about in terms of the carrier force, the Royal Navy's carrier force, comes into effect in the Indian Ocean in 1944. The raids against the various Japanese facilities in Malaysia, the Singapore Peninsula, and down into what we now know as Indonesia. That's where you have your multiple carriers, you operating in close concert with a battle group, and that battle group, when it's felt is appropriate, is used to do bombardment. So I see that as being, finally, that's the one time, 1944, the Eastern Fleet starts out with Illustrious and Saratoga visiting, and then it sort of moves on to Illustrious and Atheling, the escort carrier, and then Illustrious and Victorious, and from then on you get Indomitable and Indefatigable turning up as well, and Formidable. No, Formidable doesn't turn up, but Formidable had stripped the main gear at this point, and was ripping her armoured flight deck up in Gibraltar so that they could get it out to replace it.
Yeah, it's the other problem with an armoured flight deck. It does make, when you've got big parts down in the bottom of the ship, it is quite difficult to get to.
It is.
Yeah, it's fun.
It's not, but it's fun.
All these things.
No. But what do you think there is that correct premise, that this is the high point of RN carrier doctrine?
Yes and no. It's both the high point in that they're getting to use the stuff and they're getting it unfettered. They don't have to deal with working with allies. They don't have to deal with all the pressures of that. But they also don't get to have the battle. So it's kind of like...
But are they looking for that big battle that you're talking about, or are they looking at doing a different role, that punch below the belt, where the carriers aren't?
They're looking at that role, yes, but there's always part of the Royal Navy which would like the big battle.
Yes.
They prepare for a doctrine which is about fighting a war, but they still would like the battle.
Well,
they would like that battle.
Everyone wants to redo Jutland, don't they? So.
It's not such to redo Jutland, it's to redo Trafalgar.
Yes.
Some of the enemy survived at Trafalgar. They don't want this to happen again. It's terrible, terrible.
Oh.
But as I was saying, look, you've got it, and you have the fact. I was doing a.
There was actually quite a popular toast in one period of the Royal Navy, where they exclaimed Trafalgar was a good start. It wasn't around for long, but Trafalgar was a good start. Let's finish the job. Trafalgar was a good start. Let us finish the task. I think was the phrase. It was the phrasing used, and yeah, that's the spirit which is still in the Royal Navy. It still is in with the Royal Navy. That's annoying. I think that's gone too far. Give me a second to sort this one out. Okay, 131.57. There we go.
You have the fact. I was doing a whole talk the other day on admirals, and that was quite a fun one. But the thing is, when you're looking at the admirals going back and forwards, you start realizing very quickly.
Let me go back to here.
They prepare for a doctrine which is about fighting a war, but they still would like the battle.
Well,
they would like that battle.
Everyone wants to redo Jutland, don't they? So.
It's not so much to redo Jutland; it's to redo Trafalgar.
Yes.
Some of the enemy survived at Trafalgar. They don't want this to happen again. It's terrible, terrible.
Yes.
But as I was saying, look, you've got it, and you have the fact. I was doing a whole talk the other day on admirals, and that was quite a fun one. But the thing is, when you're looking at the admirals going back and forwards, you start realizing very quickly, when I was doing that research, just how scarce the Royal Navy comes to senior admirals who can run things out towards the end of World War II, because it's used them so much, and just how relatively junior the officers are being used, and even they are war-tired themselves. When you realise that at one point Lister Lumley is the same rank as Philip Vian, and Philip Vian is 6 years younger than him. And you think, post-war or pre-war, there wasn't that big a gap between officers of the same ranks. There were a few who were a bit of an outlier, but there wasn't that big a gap. And there were officers who were sort of bigger. You're sort of sitting there going, this is the Royal Navy is really... Philip Vian goes from being a captain in 1939 to a vice admiral by 1945. In peacetime Royal Navy, that would be freaking amazing. That would be the kind of promotion level you'd be going, yeah, this guy is the second coming of Nelson. But in the wartime, Second World War, the Royal Navy is doing this. So you've got a lot of these officers coming through. And they...
Don't get me started on Mountbatten. Oh, right on. Don't get me started on Mountbatten. He's also another one who has a meteoric, thanks to political connections and Winston Churchill.
Come up in the interwar period, they want that battle, not to necessarily refight Jutland, but because they want the battle for their generation. And there is, to an extent, some of them who are still a little bit upset with Operation C and how it went. Because they do feel that was a missed opportunity. They do feel, yes, as I said before, you can understand, no one holds it against Somerville in terms of thinking him a bad man or anything like that. But...
you can hold multiple feelings in the same heart.
He didn't get it. He came so close and he didn't get it. And it's frustrating. It's not so much anger or upset with him, it's frustration that they didn't get to do.
Is this why it tends to get sort of shuffled under the carpet?
Oh yeah. Look, the British have a great history. We tend to, when we're teaching military history, especially to our personnel, teach them our defeats. That's what we focus on. Other people look at victories. Historians look at our victories, but when we're teaching the armed forces, we focus on defeats. Operation C isn't either a defeat or a victory. It's a... It's
frustration.
Close, but not quite there. And you think, in nicest way, the Royal Navy doctrine of the 1920s and 30s was designed for that moment. Okay, we've only got 2 carriers. The enemy outnumber us 2.5 carriers to 1. They've got more battleships. They've got more this. They've got more that. What's our doctrine say? Hit them at night. Hit them hard when they can't fight back. And
He tried. He got that close.
He got within 100 miles of them. And I know, but he doesn't go back and try again because once he learns how many of them there are, and that's the thing. He tries when he thinks they're the same number as him, which is fine. But anyone can fight a battle when you're fighting an enemy who's the same number as you. It's
Hunt-class
fighting a
escort
battle
destroyer.
and winning when you're outnumbered, and that's what the Royal Navy likes to do.
Yeah. Hey, look, you know, the reason why Alex keeps talking about being British is because I'm Australian. And yeah, we're the ones who did their bidding at Gallipoli, so we're a little bit more sceptical of this approach.
To be honest, I'm very sceptical of Gallipoli as a whole thing. You know, for starters off, we told the enemy were coming. We told them where all their weak spots were, and then we turn up late. You know, it's bloody stupid, the whole of Gallipoli. But more than that, you know, you again, I have no...
She's the French.
The naval commander at the time, I can understand why he withdraws, because he's losing ships. And he's losing big ships, and that's annoying. But the first time, but if he just kept going, he'd have probably made it through without many more losses. Or if he'd actually fought and brought some blooming minesweepers with him.
Or if he just loaded the
Now they're
pre-dreadnoughts
all
at the
being
front
scrapped,
with
They
cork
had
in the
minesweepers
bows
at
and
the
just
time.
use
They were
them to go
trawlers. They
through.
were converted trawlers. They had
Yeah.
a whole load sitting in the home fleet, and he didn't ask for any. I'll be back in a second. Someone's just calling for me. No. But as I've been trying to do in my landing ship and landing craft series, is point out that after Gallipoli, the Royal Navy and the British didn't back off from amphibious warfare. They were very much still keen and interested in it and still developing it in the interwar years. But the thing is, very quickly, the reviews of Hamilton...
I've been pleasantly surprised recently by the landing ship tank video and how well that's been received, the amount of people who responded to that comments. Some really interesting comments responding to that. And probably I'll get to that comment response, possibly even in this current sort of the comment response series currently going on. Considering how many comments how many comment response videos I've got to produce to get through Christmas. It's only the 6th of December. I've got the last of Series 2 to go up tomorrow morning. And I haven't recorded Series 3's yet, videos. And that's a problem. That's something I'm going to have to work on. But I will get to them. I will get them done. Ooh. That's going to be fun.
and all the stuff he got up to and of the timing is very much, you don't do this. And at one point, they're talking about putting the landing craft, of course, on commercial ships and merchant taverns. But also, they start working out, I think it's not Warspite, it's one of her sisters, I think, or Queen Elizabeth. I think it could be Valiant, I'm not sure though. Nothing Barham. But they basically try out testing, launching them from...
Wayne to name the whole entire Queen Elizabeth class. It was one of them, but I just... my brain today as well. I did look it up afterwards and then meant to add it in and forgot to add it in, and now my brain is being just as unhelpful as it was then.
a battleship. So the idea would be the battleship would turn up with the troops aboard, the troops would get dropped down off their davits, and she'd start to be providing bombardment, so basically be rolling fun times.
So basically, you put up your sails so that the blast of the 15-inch guns can propel you towards the coast.
Possibly, but it's a case of...
But again, yes.
But the idea is basically that way a battleship could dash in, provide 5-inch and 4.5-inch and 15-inch fire support, and the troops could get in. And it was the commando raid was using a battleship.
a good one to see. That would have been a good movie. Yeah.
That would have been that is one that is, if it had actually happened, that would be one a movie would have been made about. Let's be honest. You tell a Hollywood producer, we've got a battleship,
Forget Cockle Show Heroes.
we've got a whole load of, and I think it might have been tested out. I think when it was tested out, it was tested out with some. I think it was part of the Indian exercises. I'm not sure though. I'm not 100% sure. I'm trying to think. But I think at the, you could imagine you could probably have some. If it was the Indian exercises, it would have been the Gurkhas, because of course they're the ones used for amphibious warfare practice out in the Indian Ocean. So you'd have had the Gurkhas.
Yes. The Royal Navy's original plan for Eastern warfare was, if they needed amphibious operations, the Gurkhas were going to be deployed to your shore by landing craft. With some suitable Royal Marines assistance, but it's kind of like a pre-running of the Falklands War idea, but 50 years earlier. It's fun.
And a battleship, and an amphibious assault. Come on! That is gotta be a Hollywood movie. Think of how,
Alright, well,
in the nicest way, just imagine how many people would be beating down the door to get into that cinema.
Dunkirk, you're going nowhere.
No. You're literally...
Anyway, I think that's probably where we might wrap it up, because we seem to be getting way off course here. We've gone from armoured carrier design to Gurkhas in the Indian Ocean on battleships.
They were fun.
Yes.
But no, carrier design. It's the operations.
It says wrap it up. We've
One of the
got
things
20 minutes to
I'm
go.
always interested because I love reading your site. As you know, I've used it shamelessly over the years to basically whenever I need to argue a case.
And I shamelessly exploited your thesis that you shared with me as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's fine. It works well. One of the things that I'm always interested in that you bring out is how many of the operations you're sitting there looking at and going, okay, right then, this is what we have. Let's go with it. And it is what they have to do. But you sit there and you think, that's basically also British pre-war doctrine. And I'm looking at the other navies in the world, and I'm not talking about the American and Japanese navies to this extent, but the Italian Navy and the German Navy, and I'm wondering if they missed that part in their doctrine. The idea of what do we have, let's go with it, versus the idea of we should have the perfect things here. We should have the perfect force.
one of the recurring things that I see in the veterans accounts that I'm reading, and in the audio tapes now that I'm listening to from the IWM, is this attitude of make do and mend, or just make and mend and make do. So I guess it's something that permeates from the lower deck to the upper deck, doesn't it? It's you do what you can with what you've got to the best of your ability, and I guess that's why you send Formidable up to interdict the Stuka bombers, because they're pasting your evacuation forces coming out of Crete. Yeah. You do that because you have to. You know that it's a risky move, but you do it. You do things like you send 2 fleet carriers within single engine fighter range of Sicily because you need to get that convoy through, and yet nowhere else will anyone willingly go within single engine fighter range of a major opposing enemy force. So and again, why did they do it? Well, they had to. Malta was seen to be the linchpin of victory in the Mediterranean. It was how you choked Rommel, and it was how you springboarded into Italy. So, and that carries through. Why is Illustrious fighting off Sakashima Gunto, interdicting kamikazes on their way to strike the carriers off of Okinawa? Well, it's there with two engines, because the third one, the centerline one, was never the same after being bombed so many times off on Malta. But the carrier could still do 25 knots with 2. It needed 25 knots to launch its aircraft under most conditions. and that's where it was, doing its job because that's what it was expected to do.
And that's the thing. The ships were designed to be resilient to be able to do that. That's part of the Royal Navy's functioning design, is to make the ships as resilient as they possibly can do, and make them as capable as they possibly can be. This is one of those odd things that comes up quite a lot when you're sort of dealing with armoured carriers, is that there's often a perception of focus on the armour, but even if you look at Ark Royal, if you look at the Royal Navy carrier designs, they are designed inherently from the first generation of their new carriers onwards to be as survivable and as reliable as they could be. And to an extent, the Royal Navy really didn't like them having free engines. Really didn't like them having free engines. But that was a treaty limitation. To keep the weight under the treaty requirements, they had free engines. They would prefer them to have 4. It's one of those things, I often get asked about what would the Royal Navy's perfect carrier been if they could have built it in the 1930s. Have a look at the Audacious class, as planned. 4 engines adds probably slightly more armour than they actually build in the Audacious class, because in the early 1940s they're less reliable. They are not as confident in their fighter outer defence and their guns as they are by the time they're putting the Audacious class together. But that's pretty much, if you can find copies of ships which are not too dissimilar to that as an idea, sitting in the Royal Navy's archives, because, well, that's what they wanted. And often they start off by talking about what their perfect ship would be, and then working out how they can get what they need this ship to do out from that design within the treaty limits.
Yeah, it's what you do with what you have.
Yeah, and you do it, and you don't. You carry on, and you do it regardless. And this again is what comes back to Somerville, because this is the point. He makes the right decision, but if you look at all those decisions, if you look at Cunningham, Crete, Victorious, well, if you go for
I
that,
do mean formidable.
You can make the argument that Victorious is a pretty important asset, and you're risking it for what? Evacuation of the army from Crete for this? Well, couldn't she just hang back a bit further and provide air defence for the troops trying to get out, and just do that? Why go forward? Why do the aggressive action to try and interdict? Why try to go for total victory when you could accept for her hanging back and providing air defence? But no, they went for total victory. They rolled the dice, because if they could have taken out those aircraft, there is the chance that actually, whilst you're still evacuating Crete, you might actually not lose other ships, but also you might be able to reinforce Crete instead of evacuate Crete, because you have the let-up in the air attacks and let-up things. So you might win Crete. So you're going for potential total victory at a high risk. Somerville stops the loss by going for the low-risk option. You can accept it, you can understand it. But it's not really what the Royal Navy does.
All right. Well, I think we might leave it there.
Yeah,
But,
but I wanted to bring it back and win that point, and make that point.
Yeah, I know. I know. Look, I mean,
I have
I'm
them on the
simply not
point.
as
We
wide
keep
as
fighting.
so
We keep
I'm
arguing
always
over it.
happy to accept
Fighting,
these
arguing.
points of view, because
Yeah,
it's a matter of
You
knowing
are
the
very,
whole
very
context.
widely read, Jamie. Please do
Widely
not
read on that narrow subject.
and this is the thing I would, I
Jamie is a frigging excellent historian on this topic, and on lots of other topics to do with naval war and World War II. He is really knowledgeable. He is also the first person to shoot himself down. And sometimes you see some people who use the title and give themselves the title of historian when all they do not apply the method. They do not go and verify their information. They aren't doing anything like that to pass on the stories. They're just... I don't know what they're doing. I really can't describe it. And those I have real worry about. And honestly, I don't care about your qualifications. I care about how you act. I care about how you approach history. Whether you give it the proper respect and you give the proper depth of research that's required. And if you do that when you're passing on it, you're a historian. Jamie's a historian. There are others who have the qualifications who do not do that level of research, who do not do that level of work, and frankly, yeah.
It's going to sound strange, but this is the... it always feels weird in this scenario, because I am younger than you, but if you were one of my master students, especially I get quite a lot of mature ones who go in master's PhD, because I work quite well with them, and they seem to like me for some reason, I'm not sure why. But you would get the point of view as you have a lot of life experience, you've done a lot of studying, you know what you're talking about, just have the confidence in you, because you put forward some excellent points, and your website is amazing in that without it, a lot of the stuff which is argued online about armoured carriers, about what they do, wouldn't have got where it's got. Because you've put together
that was
a resource that allows us to go to this. Because the traditional, a nice way, I've done the work, but my book hasn't, on aircraft, my PhD hasn't been turned into a book yet. It's going to be, but it hasn't been. Because when I was told, I
still getting turned down by publishers.
There's no way that's getting published. It's no. It doesn't fit with all the books that are coming out on carrier warfare, and they're all very American, Japanese centric. They're all this, and you're basically saying that no, there was another option, and actually the others come round to the other option by the end of the war, because that is the option which makes sense for fighting a war rather than fighting a battle. And there just wasn't the space for that. Now there are such publishers after the Tribal Battle and Daring.
And look, that was my point, because when I started looking at,
and I would say it's still hopeful, but yeah, Tribals, Battles and Darings has got its second edition out, and thank you everyone who's buying that. Thank you very much. And no. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I ended up going the self-publishing route with the Flare class and New class books, New class submarines books and Flare class books, which are hopefully going to be coming out once I'm through the whole current family drama that's going on. We might be we hopefully will be moving. Mum is currently going through various medical tests, etc. Once we're through all that, then hopefully I will have time to sit down, gather the funds to get all the pictures for those books, and to actually be happy with them, do a final read through, make sure they actually make sense and actually do follow through. Print them out physically. That's a good thing to do, and then turn them into Kindle books. And after they've been published as Kindle books, then see if I can get a publisher who will want to turn them into physical books. But we'll see about that one. But the reason I'm doing that is because still with the PhD thesis turning into a carrier book, even though I've done work to convert it to more of a book than a thesis, no, it's not part. It's just not. It gets buried and forgotten.
When I started looking at the carriers, it was coming from the perspective of reading fantastic books such as Inferno, and the books, a whole set of books on Franklin and Bunker Hill and Ticonderoga, Intrepid, and because I'm Australian, we learned about the American naval battles, the ones that saved Australia, Coral Sea. We took part in a supporting role in many of the others, not Midway, but we were there at a lot of the other battles. So we always learnt about the US Navy in our high school history classes. So in all these accounts, I kept on seeing these one or two sentences referring to the British carriers, very much castaway lines, and some of them were castaway lines about how much damage Illustrious took in the battle for Operation Excess in Midway. And I just wanted to find out more about it. I thought, this sounds interesting. I really enjoyed these accounts of Franklin and Bunker Hill, the incredible fight against incredible odds that they experienced. And here they are teasing me about this similar incident that involved a British carrier that I'd never heard of before.
And imagine how different those books have been if, with Operation C, if Somerville had done that. Right?
Yeah, you've made your point.
And of course there were, if I'm not mistaken, there were Australian ships there. So
I don't know. Maybe. Oh yeah, Vampire. Yeah,
Australian
Vampire was it? Yeah,
vessels.
yeah.
I'm not sure if there was
No,
a ship, but there's definitely Australian ship. Australian.
But this way, if Operation C had succeeded, I wouldn't have needed to write my website. So,
Yeah. Well,
getting
you
back to
probably
that
would have
point,
been. Let's be honest. The Americans tend to be better at publication than the British in terms of getting press. So you probably still need to write it, but you just give
He would have still needed to write it. I can guarantee that one.
the forgotten major battle which won the war.
it took me a couple of years to find this, which is the only book available about Illustrious and Operation. Otherwise, there was one more, which only touched on. It only actually gives one or two sentences per battle, but
Yeah.
it very much explains the whole doctrine and development that you've been going into, the technical side. But actually finding out what happened to the ship and its crew was incredibly difficult. So, you know,
But I remember when I was reading Norman Freeman, that's what started my PhD, because I have that book, I love that book, and I read through it and thought, this is great. But why are they going this technical route? You're going down the same... They're not just randomly going down. There's got to be a reason for it. There's got to be something going on. And I kept getting there are these teasing lines about Henderson in it. And Henderson's actually a really strong character. You can tell that from the teasing lines in there. But there is... So that's why I went and did my research, because I was going, what's happening? What's happening? And then you sort of go through it and go, oh my goodness me, the Royal Navy is going completely...
It's very similar for me as well, because, you know, after I get into Illustrious and what happened there, I'm hearing, hang on, something happened to Formidable. What? I had no idea that a carrier had been bombed during the evacuation of Crete. No idea whatsoever, and yet there it is. Sure, I'd heard all about Ohio. I'd heard all about the heavy losses sustained getting Operation Pedestal through to Malta, but nowhere had I encountered anything about the carrier fighter battle that took to get them.
Sorry. I keep seeing some people sent some comments through which flashed up on the corner screen saying they couldn't flick through the shop. And I went, well, that's easy enough for me to check. I'm currently looking at that, so I can flick through that. Yeah. The shop is working. So... Not sure what those people are messaging about. I will find out later. But sorry, it flicked up while I was on screen. I didn't realise I did it while recording this and thought,
Within that final sprint of the island, and you know, beyond that, who'd ever heard of the British Pacific Fleet?
Yeah.
You know, and that's where, because I couldn't find these books out anywhere myself, I just decided I'll gather all this information myself together in a way that I can go back over it later on and get the whole story. And ultimately, yeah, I got a bit annoyed with a few different recurring arguments on computer game websites and various other discussion forums about the very nature and role and war service history of these carriers, that I decided, well, okay, I'll put up a site, but not only will I put up a site, but I'll put up as much documentation as I can, so that people can read it for themselves and make up their own mind and not have to put up with me preaching at them.
Yeah. Whereas I enjoy doing the preaching. No, I enjoy something. With the trouble is, when you're starting to explain and trying to go into the Royal Navy in 1930s and 20s, the reason I went in that period is because the amount of people who basically jump from World War One to World War Two and think that nothing happens in those interwar years, that the navies either stay stagnant, and then suddenly they evolve all this stuff in World War Two, and I sit there and go, the amount of books I read where you would, honestly, the reader would come away with the...
That's not how it happens. It doesn't just magically appear in World War II. It's been developed before then. Sorry. I'll let earlier me rant about this now.
Impression that all this stuff suddenly appears in World War II as if by magic. And I, as you know, I've recently been looking into landing craft stuff because I was asked the question online and I said, right, and I'll do a video. And I'll do it on landing ships. I'll explain it. And I remember, and it's exactly the same as reading the aircraft carrier stuff. This all magically appears in World War II, and you're going, no, it doesn't. Okay, yes, I do agree. The landing ships, quite a lot of them, the ideas are around prior to World War II, but they don't. They are pretty much designed in World War II. The only ones which you can directly.
Let's
take
face it,
off-
they're very specialist. You're not going,
Yeah.
not exactly something that you would think of putting in your fleet lineup in the 1930s.
Yes, but the landing craft, the smaller the ships which get the people to shore, they're very much around in the 1920s and 1930s. They are incredibly around in the 1920s and 30s, especially when you look at the ones which make up the vast majority of numbers. They basically, the design is the 1930s design, and it's just being churned out. And it makes sense, because you have a design which works. Why are you going to suddenly create a new design? Why?
Well, it takes longer. It's why you can't do anything new, because when you're required to do something new, you have to start from scratch. You have to go with what you have and modify it. Now that applies to any scenario. It's pandemic response. If you go with the war games of the pandemic response that you did 1 or 2 years ago, which I'm talking from Australia's experience here, and you adapt that to the situation at hand. You don't start it from scratch. And
in the British case, you go
rewrite
for
the
the flu plans, because our plans were based on a pandemic flu. You work from them. It makes sense, because nicest way, trying to create all this stuff from scratch would take far longer and cost more in terms of lives.
And therefore present a far higher risk. But there are problems with going with existing models to try and tackle problems, because they're not necessarily designed for that specific problem, and there might be factors on them which are less than successful.
Might not be a perfect fit for the scenario you find yourself in.
That's right.
You have there.
Yes. And by the
Agreeing
end
with
of it,
earlier
you've
me.
modified it into a perfectly appropriate product.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same with the ships, the way that you progress from Illustrious, which is a treaty design, through to Ark Royal Audacious, and you've got the epitome of going with what you've got, sticking to your guns with your doctrine, but refining it into the perfect fighting machine. And I think the Audacious gets pretty close to being that in terms of its its size, its air group capacity, its endurance. It solves all those problems of the restrained treaty designs, but it still has all the advantages.
It's what the Royal Navy, it's basically the dream, which if you consider what was being, what Henderson and Goodall were sort of thinking about and looking at, and what would have dreamed of being done if they hadn't had the treaty limitations, or if the treaty arguments had gone the way they wanted. Because if you think about the size of the Audacious class, in Max's way, you don't actually have to add that much more onto the treaty limitations to really make it a viable design under the standard displacement rules. You could get 90%, 95% Audacious only on a couple more thousand tons. So if they got what they wanted in terms of the carrier treaty tonnage, and
what the Navy wanted, not what the politicians wanted. That's the trouble with the London and the two London Navy treaties. It's very much politician-led. And some of the things what Navy wanted don't take place. And the in-between one where they're trying to negotiate after London 1, actually no, before London 1, which falls apart, is because the Navy's what they want and what the politicians are prepared to accept are completely different.
Well, that could have been the case, but it wasn't. And then you've got the illustrious.
I think it's also because they chose to go with an extra carrier, whereas they could have got a few extra 1,000 tons per carrier if they'd gone for one less ship. But as you say,
again,
you get around the whole ocean.
If you're looking at a global war, you need numbers, and that's what the Royal Navy decision the Royal Navy makes with the cruisers. They basically go, we'll exchange heavy cruiser tonnage for light cruisers, and everyone's looking and going, oh, why are you doing this? This is going to damage your battle fleet. It's going to make you irrecoverably weaker. You can't do this. The Royal Navy going, no, we're quite happy to have the tonnage for light cruisers, thank you. And it makes sense for the Royal Navy because they're looking at fighting a global war where you need the numbers. You need to be there.
All right. Okay. Anyone who knows how to set up a decent war game simulation, Operation C, you can find out the details on my website and let me know how it goes.
It is a
I
good
think
war
we'll
game
have
to run.
get Drac involved for that.
We do have Suda.
And for those who don't realise, Drac, of course, is our third compadre for the Bilge Pumps podcast series, which will start coming out as soon as we manage to get one that records properly.
And again, it will be coming out again.
All right,
They'll
well,
be
thank you
coming
very
out again
much,
as soon as we
and,
manage to organise them.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
the rest of your day.
Have a good day, and happy Mother's Day to you over there. It isn't over here, but happy Mother's Day. Hope they've had a good time. Go and now. You've spent 2 hours talking to me. I think you should probably go focus to
Yeah, you're gonna have to cut this back to at least 1 hour.
No. We'll keep it for 2 hours. It'll be fun.
See you.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay. Oh. I do enjoy these videos. I do enjoy I'm not sure I enjoy necessarily going back over the reacting to them, but I do enjoy that video itself. I have to say, reacting to it, I worry I'm not adding in enough because I'm basically just agreeing with myself, going, "You were right. I like you." But no, leaving that to one side. We do need to do the proper war game that. We do need to war game that properly. It'll be fun. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. I've now got another about 5 or 6 videos to record tonight. Toodles.